I met the Alpine Dairywoman on a train from Bregenz to Appenzell, on the line through the Rhine Valley, where mountains rise on both sides, steep and close and mighty, and the sky is only a narrow strip far above, between the peaks. It was late autumn. The pastures were cleared, the cows back in the valley, and the mountains had put on their first white hat, right at the top, where the rocks vanish into cloud. She was a woman in her mid-60s, strong and healthy, with a face that had become brown and firm from sun and wind, and hands that were large and warm. Hands that had worked every day, that had milked and stirred and kneaded and carried. Her eyes were blue, a clear, bright blue, the blue of the sky on an October day in the mountains, when the air is so clear you can see every needle on the firs. She smelled of milk and hay and something smoky that I didn't immediately recognize until she said, "Cheese. That's the cheese. The smell never quite goes away. After 30 years, you smell of it as though it's been burnt into your skin." 30 summers, she told me. 30 summers on the pasture, from May to September, up at 1,200 meters in a hut of stone and wood, with 20 cows and a dog, and the silence and the stars. Every year the same, and every year different. In May, when you go up, everything is still bare and brown, and snow lies in the hollows, and the hut smells of the winter that's been there a long time. And then, in weeks, everything explodes. The grass shoots up, the flowers bloom, the cows eat and grow fat and content, and the milk grows rich and yellow and creamy, because the herbs on the pasture taste so different from the hay in the valley. She told me about making cheese. Every morning, she said, at 4 o'clock I get up. It's still dark and it's cold. Even in summer, it's cold in the mountains in the morning. I make a fire in the stove under the big copper vat, and then I milk the cows. 20 cows by hand. That takes 2 hours, and the milk comes warm and foaming into the bucket, and the cows look at me with those big, patient eyes, and the shed smells of hay and of animal and of warmth. And then I pour the milk into the vat and heat it, slowly, slowly, not too fast, and add the rennet, and the milk curdles, grows firm, becomes something else. Liquid becomes solid. Milk becomes cheese. Slowly, patiently. You can't hurry it. You can only wait and stir, and wait and stir. The Alpine cheese, she said, takes 4 months. 4 months in the cellar on wooden boards in the cool, damp air. Every day I turn it. Every day I wash the rind with salt water. Every day I look to see if it's ripening, if the holes appear, if the rind is forming, if it smells as it should smell. And when it's ready, when you cut it and the smell comes out, that full, warm, nutty smell that smells of mountain meadow and summer and patience, then everything's in it. The whole summer, every sunrise, every rainy day, every flower the cows have eaten. A whole summer is locked in a piece of cheese. You can taste it. You can smell it. You can let it melt on your tongue and taste the mountain and the meadow and the wind. I asked her what the pasture had taught her, and she looked out the window at the mountains, which glowed in the last light of day, golden and pink and white, and said, "The mountains give what you need, not what you want, what you need. On the pasture, you have little. A hut, a stove, a vat, a bed. No internet, no telephone, no news. Only the cows and the dog and the mountains and the sky. And you think you'll miss something. At first, you think that. But after a week, after 2, you notice you miss nothing. That everything you need is there. The milk, the bread, the water from the spring, the sun that comes over the ridge in the morning, the stars that are so close in the evening you want to pick them, the silence so deep you can hear your own heartbeat. And then you understand that you need less than you thought, much less. That happiness isn't in the things you have, but in the things you don't need. She stepped out in a village at the foot of the mountains, where lights burned in the windows and smoke rose from the chimneys, straight and white in the quiet evening air. She took her bag and walked away, with the firm, sure steps of a woman who'd walked the path from shed to hut and back every day for 30 summers. The mountains give what you need. I think of that when the world becomes too much, when everything is too loud and too fast and too full. Then I remember her pasture, the 20 cows, the cheese that ripens for 4 months, the silence that contains everything. The train travels on, and it smells of something warm, something good, of milk perhaps, of hay, of wood smoke, or of memory. The rattle is like stirring in the copper vat, steady, slow, patient, and my eyes grow heavy, and I sink deeper into the warmth, into the silence of the mountains, where everything you need is there, and nothing is missing. Nothing at all. The sun sinks over the flat Polish landscape, and the train between Gdansk and Szczecin moves slowly like a ship on still water. Through the open window, the salt air drifts in, salty and green, with a hint of seaweed and damp sand. I sit in the compartment, and beside me, in the corner, sits a woman with the color of the sea in her eyes. Her hands are weathered, brown and creased, with earth beneath the nails, and in her lap lies a small linen sack that smells faintly of iodine. She gazes out the window as if searching for something lost, something only she can see. I ask where she's from, and she answers quietly, without taking her eyes from the view. From the beach, north of Gdansk, where yesterday a great storm churned up the sea and threw everything about. She's been on the shore all night, she said, and read the amber from the seaweed the way other people read books. Each piece she found was like a word in a story the sea tells her. She opens the linen sack and shows me a piece of amber, small and translucent like old honey. Inside it is a tiny gnat trapped millions of years ago, motionless in the golden resin. She says some people want to grow rich from this work, that they sell the amber and question the beach like a businessman, but not her. For her, the gathering is a conversation. Each piece tells her something about time, about age, about what is lost and what remains. The train rocks gently, and I imagine the beach she's left behind. Gray-green water rolling against the dunes, wave foam spreading over black sand. She'd be there, kneeling, fingers moving through the seaweed like tools honed over many years. The sun rises, and she barely notices. The gathering is all that matters. The rhythm of the sea has become her rhythm. She tells me she's been doing this for 40 years, since she was a young girl. Amber was everywhere then, but now it grows harder to find. Fewer storms or fewer people with the patience to search. She says that's all right. The work isn't for the result, not for the number of pieces gathered. The work is itself the purpose. The kneeling on the shore, the hands in the water, the waiting for the next wave, the seeing and finding and knowing. Another piece of amber she shows me is large, white, and opaque like milk. She says she doesn't know what's inside it. Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. It's the mystery she loves, a piece of amber that doesn't reveal what it is preserved. She holds it to the light and it glows, but only from the outside. The inside stays dark and unknown. The landscape outside grows flatter and greener. Small villages with white churches, fields where farmers work by hand, bent like the amber gatherer on the shore. Everything in this region is marked by that patience, that willingness to settle and wait until the land or sea gives you what it will give. I think the greatest artists and craftspeople are often those who speak least, who understand the world through their fingers. She looks at me now, directly, for the first time, and her eyes are clear and old and wise. She asks if I've been to the beach, and I say no. She smiles a little. That's all right, she says. Not everyone has to go to the beach, but perhaps everyone must kneel somewhere and wait until they understand something that matters. Amber gathering is for her alone, but the waiting is for everyone. The sun is now very red and very low in the sky. The train keeps going, and the windows fill with red light. She slowly packs the linen sack, puts the amber back, the gnat, the white secret, everything. Her movements are unhurried, without rush, without haste. There's no hurrying for someone who has understood time. She tells me about the rain that comes after the storm, about the days when the beach is empty and the sea looks gray and angry, and how she goes anyway. In those times you find less amber, but you find something else. You find yourself at the water's edge, small and insignificant against the vast old sea. That's not a sad thought, she says. It's relieving. When you're small, you don't have to carry so much. She says that sometimes amber takes days to dry after she takes it from the water. During those days, it's opaque, cloudy, almost gray. But when it's dry, it becomes golden again. That's like life, I think, as I listen to her. The difficult times are like the water. Everything's dark and blurred. But if you wait, if you give it time, it becomes clear again. She has a bag with her, not large, not heavy, and she says she's heading to Stettin to stay for a few weeks. She has a sister there, older than her, who also has old hands and also knows what it means to wait. They'll sit together in the garden and speak of nothing in particular, and that will be enough. That will be a piece of amber, a fragment of time they share. The train rocks, and the wheels make a regular sound, like waves striking the shore. Always the same, always the rhythm. She leans her head against the window, and her eyes grow heavier. Outside, the landscape drifts past, but she doesn't really see it anymore. Or perhaps she sees it with the eyes of someone searching for amber on the beach. Someone who sees a story in each thing, who translates everything into patience. I watch her beginning to doze, and I think of the beach, the dunes, the old sea, which for millions of years has done what it has always done. It gives and it takes away, it hides and it reveals. And somewhere out there, in a bay north of Gdansk, the next storm waits, and the sand will be stirred again, and amber will be washed ashore again. Small golden stories waiting for someone with the patience to read them. I reflect on her words as the train rolls through the darkening landscape. The gathering isn't for the result, she'd said. The gathering is itself the purpose. How many people in the modern world understand that still? That the work itself is the meaning, that the doing matters more than the having. She understands it, this old woman with her withered hands, And perhaps that's why she's so calm, so fulfilled. She has no reason to rush. She has no reason to despair. She'll go tomorrow again, and the day after, for as long as her body allows. And she'll kneel and gather, and that is enough. Her breathing grows slower, deeper, and a tiny smile rests on her face. Her hands lie relaxed in her lap, and I see how the line of years is written in them, literally written in wrinkles and spots and scars. Hands that have loved and worked, that have touched the sea thousands and thousands of times. The train rocks on into the dusk, and I lean my head against the window too and breathe in the salt air and think, this is enough. This is everything. And slowly, as the amber dried, I grow quieter. My breathing becomes shallower, and the sound of the train becomes a song, an old song without words that draws me deep into sleep, away from the beach, away from the seaweed, away from everything except the gentle, eternal rocking of the journey. I closed my eyes. Just for a moment, I thought, just for a moment. But then images came behind my eyelids. No clear pictures, just colors, soft colors, blue and gray and a little gold from the compartment lamp. And those colors mingled into something that was no longer seeing and not yet dream. The train kept going, ta-dum, and each ta-dum was a little further away, as if the train wasn't quite in the same space as me anymore, as if I were already halfway elsewhere, halfway in that country where tiredness lives, where everything grows simple. The train travels through sprawling Slovakia between Košice and Prešov, and the mountains suddenly rise from the flat landscape, dark green and mysterious. A woman sits across from me, and if I look closely, I see her clothes still carry a fine pattern of honey dust, a golden powder that glimmers in the folds of her jacket. She's told me she comes from the Carpathians, from a small forest clearing where she keeps hives, dozens of them, all with individual names, all with their own characters. The air around her smells of wax and something sweet I cannot name. She speaks quietly, as if not wanting to wake the bees, though they're not here. The bees, she says, are like one large family, each with its task, each with its personality. There's a queen, of course, but she's not like a king or queen in a castle. She's a mother, and everything she does for the family. The workers are the real rulers, the ones who decide when it's too hot, when it's too cold, when it's time to seal the comb or build anew. The forest clearing where she keeps her hives is surrounded by pines and firs, and when the blossoms come in summer, everything turns gold. She shows me a photo on her old mobile phone, and I see the clearing, small as a dream, with the hive boxes neatly arranged, and behind them the forest's twilight green. She says she used to live in Prague, in an apartment with many rooms, but life there suffocated her. She wandered out of the city, wanted to do something real, something that lives, that breathes. She started with just 2 hives, she says, and now there are more, many more. Every spring a man comes who collects bees and sells them, and she buys new colonies. She's learned how to keep them, how to respect them, how to give them everything they need without taking too much. The honey is just a side matter, she says. The real wealth is living alongside these insects, this little community that flourishes on her land. She tells me about the feeling when she goes to the hives early in the morning, when the sun is just rising and the world is still dark and cool. The bees are quiet then. They've huddled together through the night, warm beside each other. And when the queen begins her work, all work begins. She opens the boxes slowly, quietly, and speaks to the bees. She says she doesn't know if the bees understand what she says, but she believes they understand the calmness, the respect, the gentle hand. The train rocks, and outside the landscape changes. growing greener and more hilly. She tells me about the plagues, the robbers, the diseases that sometimes afflict the bees, varroa mites that attach themselves to the bees and weaken them until they die. She fights this, she says, not with poison, but with love and attention. She observes, she reads the signs, she understands what the bees need before they show her. One special hive she calls Marta. Marta is an old queen, nearly 5 years old, which for a bee is a very long time. Marta has produced many, many generations, and the beekeeper says she knows Marta will soon be too weak to keep ruling. She won't simply replace Marta with a young queen. She'll slowly dissolve the hive and add the bees to other boxes. That way, she says, Marta's life still has meaning, even when the queenship ends. She speaks of summer, of hot days when the bees work so hard they literally work themselves to death. They fly and fly and fly, and at the end of their short lives, their wings are tattered like old paper, and then they simply fall from the air. A worker bee's life is short, just a few weeks in this time of year when there's so much to do. But in that time, they accomplish more than some people do in a whole lifetime. The beekeeper told me that sometimes she can't sleep at night because she worries about the bees. What if a storm comes? If the hives blow over? If disease breaks out? She's responsible for tens of thousands of lives, tiny lives that are completely dependent on her. It's a burden, but also a blessing, she says. It gives her a reason to get up in the morning. It gives her meaning. She shows me a small bottle of honey she's brought with her. The honey is dark, almost mahogany-colored, with an almost flesh-like tone. That's from the late summer months, she says, when the bees gather from the heather. This honey is bitter and sweet at once, complex, a whole life in a single spoonful. She offers me a taste, and I take it. The honey fills my mouth with a warmth I hadn't expected, and I can almost see the flowers, the bees, the forest clearing, all woven together in this golden substance. She says that honey is the language of the bees, the way they understand the world. The bees can't speak as we do, but they can gather nectar and transform it into honey. And in this honey, the whole story is written. Where they've been, what they've found, how hard they've worked. Each spoonful of honey is a small story of labor, of community, of transformation. The mountains are near now, very near, and I can see how the light falls on them. Golden afternoon light that makes everything very beautiful and very sad. The beekeeper leans her head against the window and her eyes become slits. She says she'll have to get back to her clearing soon, that it's harvest time and she can't be away too long. But these few hours on the train are like a dream, a brief trip into the world outside the forest clearing, and she's enjoying it, this peace, this sitting. I picture the clearing as it looks now, in this moment while we travel. The bees are out, working until the last light, gathering nectar and pollen, building their combs, feeding the larvae. The forest clearing is a place where thousands of tiny lives come together and create something great. When the beekeeper returns, she'll find everything exactly as she left it, and that will be a comfort. Her breathing slows, and the honey dust particles in her clothing shimmer in the falling light. She's almost asleep, and her face looks very peaceful, very fulfilled. I think she's a happy woman. Not because she has much, but because she has something absolutely important, absolutely meaningful. The bees need her, and she needs the bees. And in this mutual dependence, there is peace. She told me that in winter the hives are quiet, the bees huddled deep together, and in that time she has less to do. But she still goes to them, checks that they have water, that they have enough provisions to survive the winter. She speaks of this waiting phase as a sacred time, when the ground is frozen and the whole world sleeps. She sleeps too then, she says, with the bees. And when spring comes, everyone wakes together, as if they've shared a common dream. The train rocks on into the dusk, and I breathe in the scent of wax and honey, and I feel as if I myself am in a forest clearing, small and drowsy, while the bees hum and work, and the whole world is transformed into labor and love, and I'm simply allowed to lie there and watch and sleep. And the landscape outside became softer. The outlines of the trees dissolved. The fields became dark expanses over which the moon sometimes slid its pale light. I felt my breathing slow, my heart slow, my whole body sink downward into the warm embrace of the cushion, into the warm embrace of this train, carrying me without my having to do anything for it. It was a good feeling, a rare feeling, to be carried without effort, simply to trust that the wheels keep rolling, that the rails continue, that morning will come eventually. Between Cluj and Sibiu sits a woman across from me with pale skin and a porcelain face. But her hands are hard, and beneath her fingernails lingers a hint of salt, white and crystalline. The train travels through the plains of Transylvania, and the sun burns down on the fields. She tells me she's a visitor at the salt mine, or rather a guide, a woman who brings other people down into the old galleries, shows them the wonders beneath the earth. Her father was a miner, deeper down, where the salt is still extracted, but she is a storyteller, a bridge builder between the depths and the light. She describes the galleries as they exist in her memory, and I can see them, though I've never seen them. The galleries are built with salt, naturally, but this salt isn't white. It has colors, red and ochre and gray, all mixed together, layers of time. The oldest galleries date from the Middle Ages, she says, from a time when kings held salt more valuable than gold. The salt mine made kings rich. Whole kingdoms stood upon this salt. She leads tourists around, she says, and as she guides them, she tells the stories of the miners, men who spent their whole lives in the dark near the crystalline rock walls, breathing salt dust until their lungs turned white. Many died young. Many lost limbs in accidents or collapses. The salt mine was not beautiful, though it looks beautiful when you visit it today with modern lighting and safe stairs. Then it was a hell. Her father died, not in the mine, but afterwards, worn down by the years beneath the earth. He was a quiet man, she says, and went into the darkness every morning like into a ritual. He came out when the sun set, too tired to speak. But on weekends he took her down, even before she was old enough to truly understand. He wanted her to see it, to know that the world wasn't made only of surface light. His lungs were like salt in the end, dry and brittle, and when he coughed it sounded like crystals rubbing together. She remembers the feeling of cold, deep underground, and the smell, that strong salt smell that smelled of the sea, though she'd never been to the sea. She was a child, and the salt walls were like the walls of a castle, and she was a princess underground, walking with her quiet father. She didn't understand then, but later, much later, she understood he was trying to teach her something important. That there's beauty in hard work, that there's dignity in things that are hidden. Her father was like the mines themselves, silent, profound, full of secrets he couldn't share with words, only with his presence, his bearing, his unwavering trust. The salt mine today is no longer economical, she says. The salt is mined elsewhere, more efficiently, faster. But the old mine has been preserved, and tourists come to see it, to understand how people once worked, how they survived. She leads them down, and she shows them the galleries, and she tells them her father's stories, and in some way, the father becomes immortal. When she speaks, 1,000 dead miners speak through her, and the cold salt walls listen and remember. Part of the salt mine is now a spa, she says with a small smile. People pay money to sit in salt caves and heal their lungs. The thought amuses her and grieves her at once.
Her father breathed salt dust because he had to work, and it ruined his lungs. Now rich people pay money to breathe salt dust because they think it's good for them. The irony is painful, but there's something beautiful in it too. The mine that cost so many their lives becomes now a place of healing. The salt galleries that were misery become refuges. Perhaps, she says, the mine forgives in this way, and perhaps the souls of the dead miners are calmed. When she leads tourists through the galleries, she sometimes feels their presence, these silent, invisible witnesses, nodding as if to say, "Yes, that's good. Keep speaking. Tell the story."
She speaks of the boundaries of humanity, of the point where human ends and Earth begins. Deep underground, she says, you can't see this point, but you can feel it. The temperature changes, the humidity changes, the smell changes. It's a point without a boundary, but a point that exists, and her father knew it. She tells me about the lamps that once burned in the galleries. Small oil lamps that didn't give much light, but enough to work. She has one of those old lamps in her room at home, and sometimes she lights it and sits and watches the light. It's soothing, she says, this old light that accompanied men in their work. It connects her with the past, with her father, with all who died underground. When she lights the lamp, it's as if she's calling him, and he doesn't answer with words, but with this warm, flickering light that seems to come from the depths themselves. The train rocks, and the landscape outside is flat and golden and featureless. Somewhere beneath this earth are salt layers, old minerals millions of years old. Transylvania sits literally on a base of salt, and people don't know it. They walk over this layer, and beneath it is history, buried deep, far from the light. There are moments, she says, when she goes down into the galleries, when she can vanish, when the light of her torch is so weak against the darkness that she feels like a fly in a vast body of stone and time. She says that one day, when she's too old to be a guide, perhaps she'll visit the salt mine alone, without tourists, just to remember. Then she'll go into the deepest galleries, the ones that no longer open, that are reserved only for memories. And she'll sit there a long time until dust falls on her shoulders and she becomes salt. She'll go into the old galleries and she'll call to her father, not with words, but simply by being there, breathing, existing. The galleries will hear her, will give her an answer in the form of cold, of salt, of ancient light. Her eyes are now very tired, very distant. She sits in this train, but part of her is deep underground, in the galleries, with her father, with the men who mined the salt. Part of her will always stay there, in the darkness, in the work, in the history hidden beneath us. It's all right, she says in my memory. It's more than all right. When we love something, we give part of our heart to it, and that part stays there forever, preserved in the salt of time, unforgettable. The afternoon becomes evening, and the light through the window turns reddish, like the salt in the deepest galleries. She leans her head against the window pane, and her breathing becomes shallower. The world outside remains, but she falls into dream, where the galleries are deeper, where the salt is whiter, where her father is still young and waiting to show her something hidden beneath the surface and valuable. And I sit here, watching the woman slipping into sleep, and I think about the layers beneath us, the salt layers, the minerals, the time stacking up beneath this earth. It's a comforting thought that everything we do is preserved somewhere beneath us in the depths, conserved like salt, eternal, unforgettable. My eyes grew heavy, so heavy.
as if someone had gently placed a warm hand on my eyelids and said, "Now it's good. Now it's enough for today." And I heard the train, ta-dum, ta-dum, and I heard the quiet breathing of another passenger already asleep, and I heard the distant rush of wind at the window panes. And all these sounds were like a soft blanket laid over me, layer upon layer, warmth upon warmth, until I felt nothing except the gentle glide of the train through the night. The train between Brno and Znojmo travels through wine country, and it's summer, and the grapes hang heavy and sweet on their vines. A woman sits across from me, middle-aged, with feet large and fleshy, tanned from many years in the sun. She tells me she still presses with her feet. People say it's old-fashioned, impractical, even unhygienic. She says she can't do it any other way, and she doesn't want to. The grapes beneath her feet know the feeling. They know who she is. They trust her foot. She describes the moment of pressing, and I can see it without seeing it. She sits there, naked from the thighs down, or in an old linen skirt, and the grapes are around her feet, and she moves her feet slowly, rhythmically, like dancing, but it's work. The juice flows red or white, depending on the grapes, and the smell is everywhere, sweet and fermenting, until you're almost intoxicated just from breathing. She says it's very important to choose the right time for pressing. Too early, and the juice doesn't have enough sugar. Too late, and the grapes are overripe, and the wine becomes flat. She feels it, she says, just with her feet, with her intuition. The grapes speak to her, and she listens. Some years are heavier than others. Some vintages are rebellious and difficult. Some are docile and smooth as silk. She tells me about the work of waiting, and that's what she loves most, even more than the harvest or the pressing. After fermentation comes the waiting. The wine sits in large barrels deep in the cellar and waits. Some wines must wait a year, some 2 years, some longer. During this waiting time, something invisible happens. The wine matures, develops, becomes ever more complex and deep and sensual. She speaks of this waiting time as if speaking of a ritual, and I realize that's exactly what it is. She goes regularly down into the cellar, and she sits there in the silence and coolness, and she speaks with the barrels. She says she doesn't know if the barrels understand what she says, but she believes the silence understands. She believes the waiting understands. South Moravia is an old wine region, she says, and the soil here has been prepared for wine across generations. The people who lived before her worked this soil, and the people who live after her will work it too. She's only a brief voice in a long story of wine and earth, but her voice matters, she says, because she preserves continuity, because she says, yes, the old is still here, the old is still important. The old has value in a world that keeps speeding up and wants to forget everything. She's brought a small bottle of wine with her, an old one she made 3 years ago. She opens it carefully, and the smell that comes out is like a time machine, dark and moss-like, with notes of ripe plums and something that smells like earth. She doesn't drink much herself, she says, but she loves giving wine to others and seeing how they respond, how the wine changes them. She tells me about the grapes she selects, how she learned to work with the shears to cut only the most perfect grapes. It's not so important to have so much as to have what you do have be perfect. Every grape has a story, and that story must be told in the wine. The foot pressing is slow, she says, and that's why she does it with her feet. With machines it goes fast, too fast, and the skins get crushed too much, and the whole structure of the grape is destroyed. But with feet, with hands, with time, the grape is treated gently, is respectfully involved in the process. She says the wine has taught her to be patient. Wine tolerates no haste, no greed, no impatience. Wine is a lesson in accepting that some things can't go quickly, shouldn't go quickly. Every day in the cellar, every hour the fermentation runs, is a day the wine knows itself, understands itself. Time beneath the earth isn't like time above, she says. There's no clock there, only the inner clock of the fermentation process, beating to the rhythm of nature. And perhaps, she says thoughtfully, this is the most important lesson we all need, that there's a different time than the time of clocks, that there's a deeper rhythm we should follow. She tells me about the seasons in her cellar, how winter is deepest and coldest, and how the temperature also slows the fermentation. In spring, everything becomes faster, more active, more alive. Summer is hot and tense, and autumn is the time of great activity, when the new harvest comes and everything must be ready for new fermentation. These cycles have taught her who she is. Her feet are like the roots of an old tree, old-fashioned, powerful, with calluses and wrinkles. She leans back and shows me her soles, and I see the skin there is very thick, very calloused. Those are the feet of a woman who's walked her whole life, who's done her work, who's known the earth. Not as an abstract idea, but through direct contact. She says that in a generation or two, no one will press with their feet anymore. The tradition will disappear. Young people don't want to work with their feet. They find it primitive. But she doesn't understand how work done with the whole body can be primitive. She thinks this is the future, forgetting that our bodies can be tools, that our hands and feet can think without the mind being involved. It's a form of knowledge, she says, that can't be written in books, that can only be passed from person to person, from generation to generation, through hands, through feet, through experience. The train rocks and the vineyards pass by. Green rows, neat and endless, all the way to the horizon. She leans her head against the window and her eyes begin to grow heavy. She says she must get back to the barrels tomorrow, that autumn comes and the new harvest, and there's much to do. But these hours on the train are precious, these hours of rest before the work begins again. The wine doesn't wait, the grapes don't wait, time doesn't wait. But for these few hours, she can forget that she feels time at her heels. She tells me that grapes can speak, if you know how to listen. A certain pressure with the foot, a certain timing, and the grape gives you its acidity, its sweetness, its potential. It's a conversation, not a fight, not coercion. The best wines happen when the grapes believe they're working with someone they trust, someone who respects their nature. Her breathing grows deeper, slower, and her body relaxes. I imagine her going to the cellar at night, sitting on an old stool beside a large barrel and waiting. She doesn't wait actively. She's simply present, and that's enough. The wine ferments, and she sits there, and time passes, and tomorrow will be a new day, and she'll press with her feet again, wait again, grow patient again. And the landscape outside became softer. The outlines of the trees dissolved. The fields became dark expanses over which the moon sometimes slid its pale light. I felt my breathing slow, my heart slow, my whole body sink downward into the warm embrace of the cushion, into the warm embrace of this train carrying me without my having to do anything for it. It was a good feeling, a rare feeling, to be carried without effort, simply to trust that the wheels keep rolling, that the rails continue, that morning will come eventually. The train travels now between Sofia and Plovdiv, and the window is open, and a scent comes in so intense and old that I can barely believe it. Roses. An endless, incomprehensible scent of roses. And suddenly, I'm not here, not in this train, but I'm years back, 20, 30 years in the past, and I'm in a valley in Bulgaria, and the sun is just rising. The valley of Kazanmak, back then, wasn't like it is now. Then it was wilder, less organized, less commercial. I was here with another man, a friend, now long dead, and we went in early in the morning, and everything was still cool and dark. The roses were everywhere, in endless rows, and they didn't smell in the heat, but in the cool morning light they smelled with full force, as if the night had preserved their oil, and only in the morning did they release it. And then I met her. She was a woman, not old, but not young either, perhaps my age back then, and she had a large basket and a small scissors, and she was picking the roses. She didn't say much to me, but she showed me everything. She taught me how to cut the roses, from below, not from above, so the plant isn't wounded. She showed me how to smell, what the best time was, when the roses were ready to be picked. She told me, as we worked, that roses must be picked at 4 or 5 in the morning, before the sun grows too strong. When the sun warms, the essential oil evaporates from the petals, and the scent isn't the same anymore. The best time is that short transition time, when the night isn't quite over, but the sun has begun to wake the world. We picked hour after hour, and my hands became sticky with juice, and the scent was so thick in the air that it became almost physical, a substance you could breathe. Other women worked on the field too, dozens of them, all bent over, all concentrated, all knowing that time was precious, that these few hours defined the whole harvest. She told me about her life. She was born here, on this field. Her father had planted the roses, and his father had planted them. The roses were older than her family almost. Old plants that bloomed again and again, year after year. And they fed the family, gave them a life. But it was also a slave labor, she said with a smile. You couldn't take a holiday, you couldn't be idle, because the roses don't wait. The basket grew fuller and fuller, heavier and heavier, and the scent grew stronger and stronger. At some point I could barely breathe, the scent was so intense, so overwhelming. She laughed when she saw I was getting dizzy, and she said you get used to it, that eventually you stop noticing. But I saw that she herself still noticed, that the scent was still magic for her, still always new. At the end of the morning, when the sun rose higher and the heat began, we set the baskets aside. She showed me the oil she'd later extract from the roses, that precious golden oil, worth so much it could have been paid for its weight in gold. A whole basket of roses would yield only a few milliliters of oil, but in those few milliliters, the whole essence of the roses was concentrated. I never returned to the valley of Kazanlak, and years passed, and the friend I was with then died, and I've grown much older. But I haven't forgotten. I've never forgotten how the valley smelled, how the woman looked, how the world looked in that early morning when the roses were still secret, before the sun made everything clear. My friend's death struck me hard, and afterwards I didn't travel much, didn't see much of the world. But the valley remains, and the rose harvester remains, preserved in honey like a fly in amber, perfect and timeless and unreachable. And now, in this strain, many years later, the scent returns. Through the open window, the rose oil factories in Kazanlak are in full production, and the air is filled with the scent of the same roses, the same petals, the same early mornings. And I'm here, old. And I remember the young woman who showed me how to cut, how to pick, how to know what the roses need. The scent opens a door in my memory, and I'm there again, in the darkness before dawn, with the basket in my hands, and the world is still young and full of promise. She had told me that rose oil distillation is an alchemy, a transformation of matter into essence. Thousands of roses are steamed, their oil is captured, concentrated, until at the end, only the most essential remains. It's like life, she had said. We burn and evaporate years, and at the end, only the most essential remains, the essence of who we are. And she herself has evaporated into rose oil, into essence, into what remains when you've boiled away all the surface. She is a memory, a scent, a lesson I carry with me. I sometimes wonder if she still lives, if she still works in the valley, or if she too has grown old and passed the work to someone younger. Probably she has children, grandchildren, people who learned beneath her feet to know the roses, as she taught me for a few hours. I wonder if she remembers me, this strange man who came to her field one morning and learned to cut roses. Probably not. Probably tourists coming by wanting to learn everything aren't uncommon. But I remember. And the scent in this train, now, reminds me not only of her, but of time, of youth, of possibility, of mornings before the sun made everything too clear. The scent reminds me that some people cross our lives like butterflies, swift and light, but they leave an impression that doesn't fade. That morning in Kazanlak was only one morning, only a handful of hours, but it changed more than many years afterwards. It taught me that true mastery isn't auction, it's humility. Not control, but collaboration. It was a lesson in attention, in humility, in willingness to learn from someone you've just met, in a language only hands and feet speak. I open my eyes and look out, and the landscape has changed. The sun is lower in the sky, and the scent of the roses has grown weaker, but not quite disappeared. It sits now in my lungs, in my memory, and it will not leave again. The train will keep going to other places, to other times, but that morning in Kazanlak will stay in me forever, a light that doesn't dim. The train travels on, and the scent remains, and my breathing slows, and my heart slows, and I'm not quite here, not quite there, but I am everywhere at once, in the valley, in the distance, in the present, in memory. The roses smell, and I close my eyes, and I am with the roses, and I am with her, and I am with youth, and I am with death, and I am simply there, breathing, existing, grateful. And as the train kept going through the night, da-dum, da-dum, I noticed my thoughts slowing, the images in my head becoming softer, the edges blurring. The voices I had heard became a soft humming, a hum like from distant bees, or like an old song heard as a child and now not quite remembered. The warm air current in the compartment wrapped around me like a blanket, and I felt how my shoulders sank very slowly downward, how the tension of the day fell from me piece by piece, like leaves falling from a tree, without rush, without sorrow. You see, I've met many people in my life, but that old Oyster Counter from Zeeland, I never forgot her. It was on an autumn afternoon when I took the train from Roosendaal to Vlissingen, and the sun hung red and tired over the flat Dutch lands. The sky was painted with colors that only come in autumn, when the light wants to see the world completely fresh one more time before winter comes. The salty air streamed through the open window of my compartment, mixed with the scent of mud and seaweed, and even from the quality of the light I could tell we were approaching the sea, that the light here fell differently on the fields and houses. The woman's name was Janneke, and she was at least 80 years old. But her hands, her hands were what immediately drew me. Those fine, practiced hands that lifted each single oyster with such tenderness, as if she were taking a newborn child from its cradle. I met her that day when the tide went out and the whole landscape transformed into another planet. The sea retreated like a great animal lying down to rest, slowly, inexorably. And it left these gleaming plains of black mud and stones and endless, mathematically exact rows of oyster beds. The air above the plains shimmered with salt content and with a kind of life you can only feel when you grow completely still. She was already at her work, ankle-deep in damp silt, and her face was concentrated like that of a monk at prayer. The silt sucked at her rubber boots, and with each step she left small ponds that filled with water again immediately. Yannicka counted, you see, counted with such devotion that I realized this wasn't simply a business method, but that the numbers themselves had meaning for her. And as she counted, she spoke quiet words to the oysters, as if she wanted to tell them it was good, that she cared for them, that she valued them, that each single number was a declaration of love. Every 10th oyster she set aside in a special group, and these layered themselves by the dozen in her baskets of woven willow that had turned quite green from all the salt water and the thyme. I stood up on the embankment and watched her, and slowly I realized that counting for Yannicka wasn't simply work, but a kind of meditation, a kind of inner ritual. With each grip, with each count, she was completely present, completely here, with this one oyster, this one moment. And I saw that her body had developed a routine that felt like dancing, rhythmic and eternally repeating. She told me later, when she took her short rest and drank black coffee from an old thermos flask that sent up steam like little ghosts, that she knew each single oyster, that she read the beds like a book, that she felt with her fingertips, with her eyes, with her whole intuition, which oysters were ripe and which still needed more time to grow. The fog cloud slowly drifted in from the sea like a blanket someone is spreading over the world, and soon the world was made only of different shades of gray and white. But Yannicka kept counting, soothingly, on, and at some point I understood that the counting wasn't meant to count the oysters, but to count time, to count the tide, to count one's own breath, the steps still to be taken. With each number, the world became a little less chaotic, a little more at home, a little more familiar. She worked for nearly 6 hours, from just after the tide went out until just before the flood, when the water slowly came back and the plain began to disappear again. And in that time, we talked about her youth, about the wars she'd experienced, about the poverty and the love her husband had given her before he died 10 years before, and how life had to go on, that you couldn't just lie down and give up. She said that counting anchored her, that it helped her not to think too much, not to feel too much of the pain that still flowed like quiet water beneath her skin, that the numbers were a wall between her and her sorrow. And I understood that it wasn't sad, but that it was a kind of peace, a conscious peace with life as it is, with its weight and its beauty. That life didn't ask whether you were ready, but simply flowed on like the tides. Toward sunset, the flood came back, slowly and inexorably, and the water gleamed copper red in that last light that poured like liquid gold over the plains. Yannicka carried her heavy baskets up to the embankment, baskets full of oysters, baskets full of a lifetime of work, a whole philosophy. Her movements had grown slow, not from weakness, but from a kind of respectful slowness towards gravity and time, as if she had accepted the weight of years and was now celebrating it. You see, I hadn't missed it. That Yannicka smiled during all her work, that despite all the effort, despite all the years this work demanded of her body, in her smile she carried a contentment that can't be bought, that comes only from deep fulfillment. She loved her oysters the way a mother loves her children, loved her tide, her fog, her salty air that was so old and so ordinary and so wonderful. At the end of the day, when Yannicka prepared her baskets for trade, she told me something I'll never forget. She said that each oyster she counted had a name in her heart, that she knew the oyster beds like a gardener knows his garden, that each place told a different story of the currents and the patience of the sea. The train to Vlissingen was delayed, and I spent more time with Janneke, and we sat on an old wooden bench and watched the water growing ever higher. She said she'd come again early tomorrow, that the oysters didn't wait for her, but she would wait for the oysters, each single one, as patiently as the tide itself. And that was the moment when it became clear to me that the meaning of life doesn't lie in achieving something grand, but in being present for the small things you love. I got into my train, and as we slowly left Zeeland, I saw the lights of the distant houses, the lights of the oyster fishers going to sleep after their work. And I imagined that Janneke would go out again early tomorrow to the tide, her baskets in her hands, her words for the oysters on her lips. And that this was peace, genuine peace that doesn't come from outside, but from the depths of a lifetime of tended handiwork. Just as we all sit here now, in the gentle motion of the train, you too slowly learn to count the things that count. Each breath, each moment, each reason to be grateful. The wheels beneath you count the rails count the kilometers, and you count yourself home, to rest, to sleep. Let the tide come, let it go, and trust that tomorrow the water will return, just as Janneke, just as we all will. And as the train carries you deeper into the night, the oysters of Zeeland, Janneke's hands, the salty air of the Dutch coast, carry you gently down into sleep, where the tide begins to wash your consciousness, until you feel nothing but the love for the small things that are worth living for. And so we traveled on, the train and I, and the few other passengers sitting with me or in the neighboring compartments, each in our own small corner of the world, each on our own path to sleep. The warmth of the carriage, the soft crackling of the heating, the clack of the wheels on the rails, it all became one shared song, a song without words, a song that carries you and quiets you and says, you can let go now, you can rest now. The train continues for you, time continues for you. The world takes care of itself while you sleep. My friend, I want to tell you about a woman who lives in one of the most beautiful and most dangerous places in the world, on one of the Halligen, those tiny islands in the North Sea that huddle at the edge of civilization. Places where the land's no bigger than a dream, where the tides come and go like some great creature that can't tell the difference between friend and foe, where the floodwaters can take away everything you've got at any moment. Her name's Marlene, and she's a Seabird Healer. She tends the migrating birds who come to her hurt and exhausted on their long journey south. And if they're lucky, if fate brings them to her door, she saves them. The train I took ran from Husum to Nebel, and I was fortunate enough that Marlene invited me out to her little Hallig, an island that's really only an island when the tide comes in and the water wraps everything round. And the rest of the time, it's this marvelous, green, flat expanse in the middle of waters that are never quite still, always telling stories of the tides. It was October, and the sky was all light and shadow, painted by someone who didn't quite know the colors, but tried anyway, and every brush stroke was beautiful. The geese flew high above us in V formations, their calls distant, but near enough to touch your heart, to remind you there are still great journeys happening out there. Marlene's little cottage stood on a rise, and around it were enclosures. Not cages exactly, but open shelters made of old timber and wire where the birds could heal, where they could gather their strength for the long journey ahead, the thousands of kilometers still to come. She greeted me with a calmness I'd never seen in a person before, as though the wind force of the North Sea were no more important than the quiet winds within her own soul, as though she'd learned long ago how to live with the elements rather than fight them. She showed me first a shearwater, that dark, ghostly bird with a dancer's elegance, arrived with a broken wing, its black feathers like wet ink, its body trembling with pain and fear.
And I watched how tenderly Marlene examined its feathers, how she spoke with a gentleness that seemed reserved only for the birds, talking to them as you'd talk to old friends, to brothers and sisters. She told me this one had caught fishing line, a stroke of fortune it was still alive, that there was hope yet, that in perhaps 2 weeks it might fly again once the bones knitted and the strength returned to its muscles. And as she spoke, she massaged its wing gently in circles, soothing, healing, and I saw the bird relax beneath her hand, saw it trust, saw it understand that this was a healer, that this was a woman worth living for.
Marlene hadn't always been a seabird healer. No, she'd been an art teacher in Hamburg once, married to a kind man who carried demons he couldn't quite overcome.
20 years ago, something broke. Something in the city, something to do with addiction and betrayal, and the marriage collapsed like a house of cards in the wind. And she came to the Halligan to heal. Not just the birds, but herself, her wounds, her heart, those open places where trust used to live. She told me the sea's a great therapist, that the tides and the ebbs work like therapy, coming and going again and again, always cleaning, always forgiving. That the sea knows how to mend wounds, that every flood's a chance to begin again.
We sat together while the sun hung low on the horizon like a great disk of burning orange. And she showed me hundreds of photographs, all birds, all taken with that one kind of gentleness that can only come from someone who truly understands what a bird needs, what pain is, what healing means. I saw cranes with their long necks, wild geese in flight formation, sea eagles with injured wings slowly relearning to fly, all with Marlene's handwritten names burnt into the corner of the photographs. Because each bird got a name, so she'd know when it flew away over the great waters that this particular bird up there was hers, her bird, her child, her hope. It began to darken, and the wind grew colder. And Marlene went out into the falling night and showed me how she fed the birds, how she chopped small fish she got every day from a fisherman who also understood what it meant to stand up for something alive. She worked quietly, concentrated, her movements like a poem whispering itself on the wind's lips. Then she told me something that got under my skin. She said once she'd had a bird, a turnstone named Heino, and this bird came back to her every year after its long journey south. And she always knew when Heino arrived because it would fly first to her cottage and circle round the roof 3 times before landing. And she wept as she told me this, but not from sadness, from something deeper, something that only comes from understanding that nature can love you if you love it back. I asked her whether she didn't feel lonely, all alone on this Hallig with her birds and the great sea. And she said something I won't forget for a long time. She said loneliness is a misunderstanding. You can only be lonely if you're alone with the wrong thoughts. But if you're alone with the right thoughts, with trust that life's exactly as it should be, then that's not loneliness, that's silence. And silence is the best gift of all. The next morning I got up early, before sunrise, and Marlene made tea from herbs she'd gathered and dried herself, a secret recipe she'd inherited from her grandmother. And we sat together on her cottage's threshold and watched the dawn together, burning blood red and gold over the North Sea, the light slowly pushing back the night. And she told me I should come back in spring when the birds returned, when the Halligan came alive again with all the voices of the migrating birds, when the migration was in full flood. And I promised her I would, not because I had to, but because I knew I belonged here, with her and her birds, that this was a place where I could learn what it truly means to live. The train brought me back to Husum, and all the way I looked out the window and saw only water and sky and the last flocks of geese on the horizon, slowly heading south. And I thought about Marlene and her birds and the way she understood the world as a place where healing never stops, where love always goes on, from bird to bird, from human to creature, from heart to heart.
and I understood that her work on the Halligan wasn't isolated from the great wide world, but that each bird she healed and sent on its way was a living greeting to thousands of other places, thousands of other people, that through her hands she was sending love out into the whole world.
And now, my friend, as you sit here, listening to the train carrying you through the darkness, imagine that every bird above you, every bird flying through your dreams tonight, is a messenger from Marlene, a messenger of healing and patience. Let yourself be carried by her silence, by her gentleness, by the certainty that you, just like the birds, will gather your strength again on your own journey if you allow yourself to rest, to heal, to trust. The train rolled on so gently, and outside, the world was all darkness now. Just a few lights in the distance, the odd window where other people too were settling down to rest. I thought about how many people in the world were falling asleep at that very moment, each in their bed, in their compartment, in their room, and how we were all part of one great, quiet movement, a movement into sleep. The rhythm of the wheels on the rails, ta-dum, 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 was like the breathing of some great, friendly creature carrying us all together, through the darkness, through time. Let me tell you about a woman I met on the Curonian Spit, that narrow, fragile strip of land lying between the Baltic Sea and the lagoon like a trembling line between two worlds, where time flows more slowly than elsewhere, and where the things the sea spits up tell more stories than any thick book ever could. Her name was Eldana, and she was an amber washer, a woman who knows how to find the golden tears the earth gives up and bring them back to brilliance, who understands that behind every stone waits an eternity. The train from Kaliningrad to Klaipeda ran along the edge of this spit, and I saw her even from the window, a bent figure on the beach surrounded by brown seaweed and black stones. And I understood at once that this was a woman who speaks to the sea, who understands a language older than words. I got off and made my way down over a path of stones and shell fragments, and as I drew closer, I saw her hands were red and cracked from the work, from the freezing water and the sand, but her eyes glowed golden like the amber she was searching for, her whole being bathed in that light. Aldana was nearly 70 years old, and she'd spent her whole life on this spit, embedded in the light of this fragile landscape, gathering amber the way other people gather memories. She told me autumn was the best time because that's when the great storms came, the furious ones, and they'd tear the amber loose from ancient beds, from layers older than mankind itself, and the sea would spit it out like a child grown tired of its toys. She worked every day when the temperature fell and the wind howled and the air turned like glass, and she'd wash the amber with her bare hands with freezing Baltic water that reddened and cracked her hands. She showed me a piece of amber that looked like liquid honey, translucent and warm despite the autumn wind's bite, and she said there was an insect trapped inside, a mosquito that landed here 50 million years ago, older than all dynasties, older than all languages, older than mankind itself, and that she, Aldona, had been chosen to set it free, to preserve it, to give it back to the world, that this was her sacred task. And as she spoke, she rubbed the amber gently with her wet, red hands, and it was as if she were singing a song only the amber could hear, an ancient song. This was a private ceremony between them both, a communication beyond words, beyond time. Aldona told me, too, that not all amber was the same, that some was dark brown, some orange, some almost red, and each color told a different story, and that the inclusions, the insects and plant remains trapped inside, were the most precious thing, that these were windows into another world, that through these windows you could see into the past itself,
into a life long gone but still somehow present, preserved in the amber. In that moment, I understood that Aldona wasn't simply searching for amber, but that she was a kind of archaeologist of time, that each stone she found was a message from another world, another era, another existence. She wasn't searching for treasure, but for stories, for proof that life is older and greater than our short years, that we're merely visitors in a story that began long before us and will go on long after. The wind grew colder, and the waves crashed higher against the spit, and Aldana worked on, relentless, as though the sea were a friend whose tantrums she understood. She told me that as a child she'd known another amber washer, her grandmother, and this grandmother had taught her that amber wasn't just a stone, but that it stored light, that it carried within it the sun from millions of years ago. We walked further down the beach together as the wind grew stronger and the sun sank lower, and Aldana showed me her collection, which she carried with her in a heavy bag. Hundreds of small and large pieces of amber, all with stories, all with names, all with their own personality. This one was Vinus, named after her late husband, a fisherman who died on the sea. This other was Lima, after an old goddess of the land, a power older than civilization. And this small one was Jurgis, after her grandson, who lived in the south in Lithuania and visited her only twice a year. And as she spoke each name, she'd stroke each stone as if she were giving it strength, sending it love across the seas so that one day this love would reach her grandson. She told me something very profound at that moment. She said that gathering amber had taught her that life was the same way, that you can't keep everything, that you must let go to make room for what's new, that the most beautiful things are often the ones you find for others, not for yourself. She sold her amber to tourists, but only to eat, not to grow rich. And the most beautiful pieces she kept for herself, in her collection, like prayers in a church. The storm grew more violent. The waves crashed higher. The wind became a living force trying to blow us off the beach. But when I asked Aldana whether we shouldn't go inside, into her little cottage that I could see from the shore, she just shook her head and said she'd stay 2 hours more, that the storm was the best time, that the amber was most active now, that it had the most energy now, that it was in this rage that the sea tore the old amber loose. And I stayed with her, and we worked together in this chaos, and my hands grew red and cracked too from the freezing water and the sand. But I finally understood what it means to stand at the edge of the world and wait for small miracles. That this is patience, real patience. In the evening, as the sun sank red and painful behind the Baltic, we sat in her little cottage lit by candles, and Aldana made a simple stew of vegetables and fish, and we ate together, and she told me stories from her youth, long stories of lovers and wars, of years when life was very hard, of times when it seemed the world might break in two. But as she spoke, there was a smile on her face, as if everything heavy could also be light if you carried it long enough, if you carried it in love, if you understood that even the heavy things are worth living for. When I left, she gave me a piece of amber, a beautiful one that glowed like fire, and she said it was from my heart, that I should keep it until my heart was golden again like this stone. And I knew this wasn't a casual gift, but a blessing, that Aldona had given me a piece of her soul. The train took me to Klaipeda, and all the way I looked out the window at the spit where Aldona would still be working, still washing her amber in the cold Baltic. And I held my amber tight, and I felt the warmth of millions of years trapped inside it. And I understood that Aldona had taught me the art of waiting, of searching, of finding beauty where others see only pain. And as the train carried on through the night, ta-dum, ta-dum, I noticed how my thoughts grew slower, how the images in my head grew softer, how the edges blurred. The voices I'd heard became a gentle hum, a humming like distant bees, or like an old song you heard as a child and now can't quite remember. The warm air in the compartment wrapped itself round me like a blanket, and I felt how my shoulders slowly sank down, how the day's tension fell away from me piece by piece, like leaves falling from a tree, without hurry, without sorrow. My friend, I want to tell you today about a woman who lives in a little cottage by the harbor in Schleswig. A woman whose hands are so skilled she can turn holes into patterns, who brings the broken back to life, who knows that in every hole there's also a possibility. Her name is Ingrid, and she's a net mender, a craftswoman of a special sort, and I met her quite by chance when the train was passing from Flensburg to Kiel, there on the waterfront of that old harbor town. The cottage was very small, and it was full of nets, hanging on the walls like a fisherman's dreams, like dreams of abundance and of suffering, of successful voyages and of storms. Ingrid was very old, at least 85, and her eyes were green like the sea itself, like the sea on a calm day, and her hands didn't shake even though she worked so long, even though she'd been working for decades. She was surrounded by all manner of materials, fine nylon thread in gray and black, thick cotton rope, old fragments of cotton netting she'd collected from here and there, from fishermen, from the old boat sheds round the harbor, from abandoned fishing cottages. She invited me inside, and I saw at once that this was a sacred place, not just a workshop, but a shrine, a temple of patience, a place where time flows differently. She showed me a net she was just mending, a large, heavy net, and told me it came from a fisherman whose boat went down in a storm many years ago, whose family I'd seen round the harbor, a widow with 2 children. She could have bought a new net, it would have been cheaper, but no, she wanted to repair this old one, because this net had history, this net had a soul, this net was a family. Ingrid worked very slowly, with a patience that seemed endless, as unshakable as the tides, and she explained every movement to me, every crossing of the threads, each single knot, the direction the threads should go, the tension, how tight or loose, as if this were a sacred ritual that couldn't be hurried, that wouldn't tolerate a mistake. She said mending nets was like life. You're always finding holes unexpectedly, through wear or accidents or blows of fate. You're always having to repair. You're never finished. There's no end point. There's only the path, the daily practice of mending, of going on. But as she said this, she smiled quietly, a deep smile, a smile of understanding. And I realized this wasn't sad, this wasn't pessimistic, but this was the truth of everything, that everything that lives must keep mending, must always try to be better, that this is life itself, that perfection isn't the goal, but the continuity of the attempt, the persistence of love. She offered me coffee, very strong, very black coffee in an old china cup, and we sat together in her little cottage while the autumn wind howled outside like a hungry beast, and the seagulls screamed over the harbor with their piercing cries. Ingrid told me about her youth, about the time when she started mending at 14 because her mother grew old, because the family couldn't afford to pay an apprentice. She said she never dreamed of doing other work, that this was her calling, that she felt when she made a knot that this was a prayer, that for someone it meant a kind of blessing, that every knot was a hope. I asked her whether she didn't feel lonely, alone in this cottage by the harbor, without family, without other craftspeople around her, without anyone who understood her work. And she said something I won't forget, something deep and wise. She said she wasn't alone, that fishermen came every day, that people came every day with their broken nets, with their stories, with their trust, that every net was a person, that every hole in a net was also a hole in a family, in a story, in a hope, and that she, Ingrid, would understand these people when she mended their nets, that she'd speak directly to them through the threads and the knots, that the threads were a form of prayer, that this was a language older than words, that this was the language of hands, a language passed down from grandmothers to grandchildren, a language that will never die as long as there are hands willing to work.
She showed me her specialization, the repair of old nets with historical value, this sacred work, and I saw a whole collection of nets over 100 years old, all meticulously restored by Ingrid's hands, her masterpieces, her dreams made of thread and knots. She could tell the history of every net like a historian, the name of the fisherman who'd owned it, his family, the kind of fish he'd caught with it, the tides and seasons when this net had been used, the storms it had survived. And I understood that Ingrid didn't just mend nets, but that she kept the whole history of the harbor town alive, that she was a keeper of memory, that her cottage was a museum for a way of life that was slowly disappearing, that she did everything to protect this craft from being forgotten.
At the end of my visit, Ingrid offered me a piece of an old net, a precious piece she'd just finished, restored from a net that was 100 years old, that had known generations of fishermen. And she said I should lay this cloth round my heart, that I should carry it in my pocket, that I should put it under my pillow at night, so I'd always know that even if my heart got holes from living, from rejection and disappointment, it could always be mended again. It could always become whole again. That no wound is incurable. And I took this piece of net, and it was light as a feather, barely there, but heavy as the whole world, as all the years trapped inside it, as all the knowledge and patience and love she'd given me in those few hours. I left Ingrid's little cottage with a heart full of awe, full of respect for this woman who in quiet solitude made the impossible possible, who didn't throw away broken things but loved them until they were whole again. The harbor at Schleswig was gray and wet in that autumn twilight, the sun very low on the horizon, the seagulls flying in great circles over the rooftops searching for food. And I thought about all the nets beneath the water catching fish that had no idea they were part of a very ancient game, a game between human and nature, between hunger and survival. And as I left Ingrid's cottage, I understood that her work was more than craft skill, that it was a form of meditation, of prayer, of love for the work itself. She didn't just save nets, but she saved the ability of people to respect craft, to not look down on manual work, but to see it for what it truly is, sacred labor that makes life itself possible. And as the train now carries you toward Kiel, carry Ingrid's wisdom with you too. The wisdom that repair is possible, that healing is a craft, that life lives in the gaps, in the knots, in the crossings, in those places where two parts become whole again. Let the seagulls cry, let the wind howl, let your heart have its holes. For these are the places where love flows in, where patience does its work, where you learn not just to be, but to become whole again. The train went through a tunnel, and for a moment it was completely dark outside. Just the sound, just the echo of the wheels on the tunnel walls. Ta-dum, ta-dum. And then we were outside again, and the night took us back like a mother taking her child back into her arms after a short outing. I thought how beautiful that is. Tunnels and night, and then tunnels again and night again, and on and on and on and on. And after a while, you don't notice anymore what's outside and what's inside, because everything flows together, because everything becomes one, because sleep is so near you can almost smell it. Imagine, my friend, a place where smoke rises into the autumn sky like a prayer, a whole column of gray smoke ascending all day long, where the air smells of salt and wood fire and of thousands of years of craft, of generations of fathers and grandfathers. That's where the Eel Smoker from Mecklenburg works,
a woman named Hedvig, a sorceress of smoke. And I met her on my journey from Rostock to Schwerin. And I want to tell you her story so you might understand what it means to pursue a craft with your whole heart, not as a profession, but as a calling.
Hedwig was already 70 years old, and she'd spent her whole life smoking eels.
70 years in a small smoking chamber her father had built, which his father had built, and whose great-grandfather probably had a version of too. A craft as old as the Mecklenburg coast itself. She stood every morning at 4 o'clock in the dark when the world was still asleep to light the charcoal burners to keep the temperature at exactly 67 degrees Celsius, not more, not less, not a tenth of a degree more. Because eels, she said, were very sensitive, very particular about what they needed. They knew precisely what was good for them and what wasn't. I arrived at her cottage on an early autumn morning, and the air was already filled with smoke, golden and spicy, and with a warmth that warmed my skin at once. Hedwig smiled as though she'd been expecting me, as though she always knew exactly who was coming. She showed me her smoking chamber, built from old, blackened wood, so dark with generations of smoke that you could barely make out the grain. And she said the chamber spoke more than she did, that it had a voice made of smoke and experience, that you had only to listen very still. The eels hung in rows from poles, their skin shining golden like old coins, their flesh white as snow. She told me the eels had behind them an incredible long journey, that they came from the Sargasso Sea, that mysterious place in the middle of the Atlantic, that they'd swum thousands of kilometers through oceans and rivers, that they'd followed the call of their ancestors back to where they were born, and that they came here to die, to experience here their final transformation, their transformation from life into peace, and that it was her, Hedwig's, sacred duty to make this transformation dignified, that she didn't simply smoke eels, but gave them a kind of rest, an honorable release, that she completed their journeys, that she gave them a final home. She showed me how she selected the eels, how she felt with her hands, how she pressed the ribs, which eels were ready for the smoking chamber, which weren't yet ready for this final transformation. She said each eel was different, each had its own story, that some ought to be smoked faster and some more slowly, that some eels were young and quick, others old and wise and slower. And as she spoke, she moved her old white hands over the eels in the chamber, tenderly, respectfully, and it was like some kind of diagnosis, a meditation, a prayer, a farewell to these creatures to whom you owe everything, to whom all mankind owes everything. We spent the whole day together in her smoking chamber, in this sacred space, surrounded by smoke and warmth and spices. And I helped her turn the eels every hour, gently, so the heat was distributed evenly, so no eel burned too much, so all were treated with respect. And she taught me to listen to the smoke, to watch the golden color, to feel the time, not by the clock, which didn't matter here, but with the body, with instincts, with an inner clock older than civilization. She said this wasn't something you could learn from books or videos or modern teaching aids, but something you had to learn with your body, that it was like a dance, a very old dance, a dance of the generations, repeating itself day after day, but always different, that every day brought new lessons depending on how the eels were, how the wind blew, how the air smelled, that you could learn forever from this process. Hedwig told me about her husband, who died 10 years ago, a gentleman whose voice was like gravel, and how he'd helped her, how he always chopped the wood and brought the charcoal, how he loved the smoking chamber the way a father loves his children, and how, after his death, she didn't know for a long time whether to go on, whether the smoke would still mean anything without him, whether life was still worth living. But then, she said, came an autumn morning like today, and she stood alone in the smoking chamber, and suddenly she understood that the smoke hadn't stopped speaking, that it still carried her husband's voice, that it still knew who she was, that it still knew what she had to do, that she wasn't alone, that the smoking chamber itself was her husband, that the work itself was a form of love that never ends. In the afternoon, when the eels were finished, we sat together on an old wooden bench in front of the chamber, and we ate warm, smoked eel flesh so tender it melted on the tongue. And it tasted of all the years, of all the love, of all the patience, of the sea and of the smoke and of the work of generations. Hedwig said this was the best meal you could eat, that it was a gift you couldn't buy with money, that you had to earn it with time and understanding and love. And as we ate, she told me about the seasons, about how eels tasted best in autumn when they were ripe for their final journey, when the flesh had reached its full potential. She also said the smoking chamber was alive, that it pumped like a heart, that it worked all night, even when Hedwig slept, and that it was a kind of partnership between her and the smoke, that she wasn't simply the boss, but a kind of assistant to the process, that the chamber gave her the orders, not the other way round. She gave me 2 smoked eels to take with me, precious as jewels, wrapped in old newspaper, and she said I should give these eels to someone I love, that this was a kind of blessing, a kind of passing on everything she'd put into her life, all her wisdom and her love and her patience. And I took these eels in my hands, and I felt the warmth still in them, the warmth of the smoking chamber, the warmth of her hands, and I knew this was worth more than gold, that I'd been given a great secret, that I held love in my hands. The train from Rostock to Schwerin ran through the flat Mecklenburg landscape, and behind me I could still see the smoke from Hedwig's smoking chamber rising into the autumn sky. And I understood this wasn't simply smoke, but the voice of a woman who'd given her whole life to her craft, who'd poured a constant stream of love into the world. And as you sit here, as you listen to me, as your heart slows and your eyes grow heavy, think of Hedwig and her eels. Think of the smoking chamber and the smoke that never stops, that never forgets, that is never simply just smoke. My eyes grew heavy, so heavy, as though someone had gently laid a warm hand on my eyelids and said, "Now it's all right. Now it's enough for today." And I heard the train, to-dum, to-dum, and I heard the quiet breathing of another traveler already asleep, and I heard the distant whisper of wind at the window panes, and all these sounds were like a soft blanket laid over me, layer by layer, warmth by warmth, until I felt nothing but the train's smooth gliding through the night. You know, when you've been sitting in a train long enough, watching the landscape flow past, a wonderful calm settles in eventually. I was sitting there one damp October afternoon in my compartment between Erfurt and Eisenach, watching a couple of young people get off when she came in. A woman with earthy hands and a large linen bag that smelled pleasantly of forest and autumn. She wasn't young anymore, but her eyes were alert and watchful, as if she were constantly observing something, as if she'd learned to see the small things. She sat down across from me, and I saw her pockets and bags held small brown chestnuts everywhere. The pods were still on them, the green leathery husks with their fine spines, and some had split open, revealing their glossy treasures. Chestnuts, simply. Those wonderful smooth things that smell of damp autumn and earth. I asked her quite simply, smiling a little, what could be valuable enough that she was out with them at 11 o'clock in the evening? She turned to me then, and her eyes lit up like striking a match in the dark. Her name was Margaret, and she told me about her craft, which had almost been forgotten. The sweet chestnuts in the Thuringian forest, she said, are not to be confused with the poisonous horse chestnuts you see in parks everywhere. No, the real sweet chestnuts, you only find them in certain places, and you have to know how to gather them, how to process them. She supplied small bakeries in the villages with chestnut flour and candied fruits. It was a craft her grandmother had already practiced, and it had nearly been lost in the years when everyone just went to the supermarket.
She described how you have to find the chestnuts at the right time, when autumn brings exactly the right moisture. Not too early in September when the leaf carpet isn't dense enough yet and some of the fruits are spoiled, and not too late when other gatherers have already come through and emptied everything. It's about patience, you see, about a fine sense of when nature distributes its gifts most generously. You have to read the forest like a book, she said, and every page rewrites itself daily. She spoke of places she's known for 40 years, beneath certain old oaks where the best fruit falls. She knows every trunk, every stone, every hollow in the ground where water collects and the chestnuts grow especially sweet. Sometimes she visits the same spot twice in a year, once to explore, once to gather. That's not wasted time, she said, but preparation, a kind of meditation with a purpose. She described how the wild tracks in the damp moss show her which deer and badgers passed through in the night. Margaret then showed me individual chestnuts from her bag. She had a special way of talking about them, not like someone advertising goods, but like someone hopelessly in love with something. She turned each chestnut in her hand, showed me the small scar where it came from the pod, explained which size was best for which recipe. The medium ones, she said, are perfect for bakers because they give even flour. The large ones you can candy, and the very small ones can go in soups. I asked her whether it was difficult to make a living from this, at a time when barely anyone knows much about chestnuts anymore. She laughed quietly then, and it was a laugh that expressed understanding. She said the good things earn slowly, but they stay with people. The bakery in Eisenach she was heading to, it bakes a chestnut bread every harvest season, and it sells better than anything else. People want it, even if they don't know why they want it so much. It's something old, something real.
She described the process, how to dry the chestnuts without spoiling them, how to grind them to a fine flour that smells of autumn and tastes sweet. It's nowhere near as simple as with other nuts, she explained, because chestnuts have a lot of starch and less oil. You have to watch the moisture exactly, store them in air in special baskets, know about the risk of mold. That's knowledge you don't learn from books, but from older people who've understood it. Her mother showed her, and if she had no children wanting to carry it on, it would end with her. She also told me about the quiet mornings in the forest, when the dew still lies on the moss and the low autumn sun just begins to shine between the dark trunks. Sometimes she's been out since 5 a.m, bending down, breathing in the cool autumn air, listening to her footsteps crack in the leaves. She said that's not wasted time, even if you don't earn money from it. That's time spent with the earth, and it has its own value, a value the banks can't measure. The smell of mushrooms in the damp forest is intoxicating, she said. I saw her glance several times toward the window, and I noticed she was growing tired from the long day. She'd spent it since early morning in the forest, she said, bent over the whole day, standing and bending again. Her legs ached, but it was a good ache, an ache that meant you'd done something true. She showed me her hands, red and rough from gathering, and I saw in them the years of work and love. She also described the grinding process, how to grind the chestnuts finely without destroying the nutrients. That's very special knowledge, she said, because chestnut flour is finer than other flour, more brittle. You have to grind it in special mills, have to watch the temperatures so you don't destroy the oil. Then the flour is the color of amber, and it smells of autumn and sweetness. Every scratch told of a forest, an adventure, a harvest. Margaret also told me about the other gatherers she sometimes meets in the forest, people searching for mushrooms or berries or rare plants. They all shared this same quiet respect for nature, this same rhythm in their movements. You can see it, she said, in the way someone walks through a forest. Either you listen to it and walk quietly, or you fight against it and you only feel your legs, the pain, the impatience,
It's like a dance that nobody taught you, but you learn if you listen long enough. She then asked me whether I ever went into the forest myself, and I had to laugh because it's been a long time since I wasn't just sitting in a train. But I told her about my years when I was still on my feet, and how sometimes I'd gather mushrooms too, not because I knew how, but because I liked being outside. And I noticed she understood me without my needing to say much. We were both people who appreciated nature's patience. Then we were already arriving at Eisenach. I saw the city lights approaching, felt the speed slow down. Margaret gathered her bags, but not hurriedly, with the same calm movement she'd done everything all along. She said goodbye to me quietly, and I noticed she was satisfied to have told her story. Perhaps, I thought, she simply wanted someone to know that this craft still exists, that it still matters.
And now you can imagine, dear listener, how Marguerite went out into the night, her linen bag full of chestnuts, her head full of the places in the forest where she'll gather again tomorrow. The bakery awaits her gifts, and the bread will smell of autumn and of all the patience she's poured into it. The forest will keep giving its chestnuts as long as there are people to value them. And you, dear listener, you can now close your eyes and imagine how the leaf carpet carries you, how autumn holds you in its damp, cool arms, and how everything that matters, simply and patiently, comes to pass.
It was a cool October afternoon when I got on at Passau, and on the journey to Regensburg, I noticed a woman sitting opposite with a large field notebook and several thick ledgers. She seemed completely absorbed in her work, like someone who'd forgotten the whole world around her. She kept stopping, going to the window to jot something down, or she'd open a small magnifying glass and examine with it a tiny green moss sample in her hand, carefully wrapped in a little paper packet.
I was so fascinated that I finally asked her what could be so fascinating about a tiny bit of greenery. She looked up, and I saw at once that I'd found someone who burns for their work like a fire. Her name was Dr. Sophie, and she was a moss researcher, a bryologist, as she called it. She was mapping the different moss species in the Bavarian forest, a task she'd been pursuing for more than 20 years, with a passion and patience you had to admire. She explained that most people don't see moss, even though it's everywhere. It grows on stones, on bark, on damp soil, and it tells the story of the forest's health. Each moss species prefers different conditions, different moisture levels, different light, different nutrient content. If you want to know how the forest is doing, you have to study the mosses, she said, with a passion I found moving. Moss is like the forest's soul, the whispering heart that tells the truth. She then showed me her notebooks, thick, well-thumbed things in which she'd been recording her observations for years. Every page was full of tiny sketches, coordinates, precise descriptions of where things were found. She'd developed a system to map the mosses and understand how they'd changed over the years. Some species were becoming rarer, some had disappeared entirely, others reappeared as if they were on a journey. Nature speaks if you listen to her, she said with a gentle smile. She told me about the damp mornings in the forest when the moss is still wet with dew and shines like little jewels. That's the best time to study it, she said, because then you can see its structure clearly, the fine leaves, the tiny spore capsules. She described how sometimes she'd sit for hours under a tree, magnifying glass in hand, just to really understand one species of moss. It's a waiting, a listening, a taking of time for the small, for what modern people see as insignificant. Sophie spoke about the beauty of mosses that people normally ignore because they're too small, too humble. Under the microscope, they're like little works of art, geometric shapes, perfect symmetries. Each species has its own form, its own way of growing. Star moss with its star-like shapes, haircap mosses with their fine hairs, the silvery, shining silver moss, all have their own names, their own stories. She recited the old names that foresters would have known before modern scientific names took over.
I asked her which moss was the most beautiful she'd ever found. She had to think for a long time, and then she described a tiny moss called Dicranum scoparium, which shimmers gold-green when the light's right and the moisture is just so. It grows only in the oldest parts of the forest, where the soil is particularly rich in nutrients, where the earth is still ancient. She'd found it only twice, and each time it was like discovering a little treasure, something visible only to those who know how to look. She told me about her research, how she was trying to document the moss diversity of the Bavarian forest before it disappears forever. The forest is changing, she said with concern in her voice, because of air pollution, because of climate change, because of the way people use and sometimes abuse the forest. Some species have already become rare, some have disappeared entirely. It's like a race against time, an attempt to save the knowledge before it's too late, before the generations that had this knowledge are gone. Sophie described the different forest types she'd mapped. There were the damp ravine forests with their rich moss cover, where the moss is so dense you sink when you step on it, and the damp earth's steam gets into your lungs. There were the older beech forests, where moss grows on the trunks like green wallpaper. There were the conifers with their sparse moss cover, only for special species. Each place its own ecosystem, each place full of life if you only know how to look. She showed me photographs, small, carefully shot images of moss species in their natural habitat. Some were in color, some in black and white, all with handwritten notes and dates, just like the entries of a 19th century naturalist. She could remember mosses the way other people remember faces, she said, laughing. When she sees a forest floor, she knows right away which mosses grow there, how old the forest is, how healthy it is, whether it's been tended or neglected. She told me about a special moss project where she leads school classes into the forest. Children still marvel, she said, when they understand that the green patches under the trees are living things, that every place has its own moss landscape. She collects the mosses and dries them in special presses, and then the children make herbarium pages. That's like little works of art, she said, and the children learn to see nature with new eyes. I asked her whether it wasn't lonely doing this work alone, spending hours in the forest, magnifying glass in hand, notebooks filled. She shook her head very slowly and gently. No, she said, I'm never alone. The forest is with me, the mosses are with me, the whole story of nature is with me. And sometimes I meet other collectors, other people who understand that it's important to see the small things, to understand the greater connections. She described a typical autumn workday when damp moss grows most lushly. She'd set out early in the morning with her notebooks and magnifying glass, a bag full of moss samples in special collection boxes. She'd reach under the trunks, examine the moss carefully, take notes. Sometimes she'd take a little moss home, just a tiny piece, to study it later under the microscope. She told me especially about autumn, when the sun shines low between the trunks and the moss glows in a wonderful green, the way light glows through crystal. The scent of mushrooms rises up, the damp moss hums with life. Everywhere there are traces of wilderness. That's when the forest is most alive, when all forces flow together. Sophie said that in this time she feels like part of the forest, as if she'd become moss herself, rooted, patient, knowing. She also showed me a moss identification book she'd written herself. It was small and handy, with illustrations she'd drawn. She'd written it for people who wanted to start exploring their local mosses. The book was her legacy, she said, a way to pass on her love. She gave me a copy, and I felt how heavy and precious it was in my hand. And when we arrived in Regensburg, Sophie said goodbye to me quietly. She took her notebooks and her moss collections and disappeared into the evening dusk, but not before giving me one last reminder. Look at your feet when you walk through the forest, she said. The small carries the wisdom of the great. And you, dear listener,
can now close your eyes and imagine sitting under an old tree, feeling the moss beneath your fingers, smelling the damp earth, and slowly, very slowly, drifting into sleep.
And so we traveled on, the train and I, and the few other passengers sitting with me in the compartment or in the neighboring ones, each in their own little corner of the world, each on their own path into sleep. The warmth of the carriage, the quiet crackle of the heating, the click of the wheels on the points, all of this became a shared song, a song without words, a song that carries you and soothes you and says, you can let go now, you can rest now. The train travels on for you, time travels on for you, the world takes care of itself while you sleep. The train went through a tunnel, and for a moment it was completely dark outside. Just the sound, just the echo of the wheels on the tunnel walls, ta-dum, ta-dum. And then we were outside again, and the night took us back like a mother taking her child back into her arms after a short outing. I thought how beautiful that is. Tunnels and night, and then tunnels again, and night again, on and on, and on and on. And after a while, you don't notice anymore what's outside and what's inside, because everything flows together, because everything becomes one, because sleep is so near you can almost smell it. Between Heidelberg and Eberbach, on a damp autumn evening, a woman got into my compartment who smelled of mushrooms. Yes, you're right, mushrooms. It was an earthy, sweet scent that came from her, mixed with the smell of damp moss and wet leaves. Her pockets were full of every sort of mushroom, neatly carried in linen bags. She wore an old, worn dress, and her hands looked as if they'd spent her whole life in the forest. Her name was Gertrude, and she led mushroom walks in the Odenwald, but not the way modern tourist operations do them. Gertrude was a mushroom keeper, as she called it, a custodian of the mushroom forest, almost like a priestess. She knew not just the names of mushrooms, but the old names too, the names her grandmother still knew. The fly agaric was the devil's mushroom, the button mushroom, the field stander, the penny bun, the noble mushroom. She spoke about mushrooms with a familiarity as if they were old friends, trusted acquaintances from many decades. She knew their faults and their virtues, where they grew, when you could find them best, under which trees. She showed me a collection of mushrooms she transported in special cotton bags, each carefully labeled. There were penny buns, large and marvelous with their thick stems and dark brown-black caps. There were chanterelles, delicate golden yellow with their characteristic and rather peculiar smell that some people love and some hate. There were poisonous mushrooms too, fly agarics with their red caps and white flecks like something from a fairy tale, destroying angels, white and unobtrusive but dangerous as hidden poison. Gertrude told me she'd been leading mushroom walks for 50 years, not for commerce, not for money, but because she believes people have a right to understand their home. She leads small groups into the forest, always in autumn when mushrooms grow most abundantly. She shows them how to tell a good penny bun from a poisonous one, how to find chanterelles hidden under damp leaves, how to gather a mushroom without damaging the mycelium. She described the Odenwald in autumn, how the forest smells of mushrooms, sweet and earthy at once, how these marvelous formations grow everywhere, out of damp soil, out of rotting logs. The mushroom scent is intoxicating, she said, with eyes closed. Sweet, earthy, with a note of decay and renewal. Mushrooms are like little palaces the nature builds overnight and tears down again. They teach us humility, that nothing lasts forever. She told me about a special mushroom she particularly loves, the autumn truffle. This mushroom hides underground, and you need pigs or dogs to find it, but only specialists do that in other countries. She never had the means to search for truffles, but she dreamed of it, she said, laughing. Once, she said, I found one by pure chance, and the mushroom was like black gold, precious and delicate.
I asked her which mushroom was her favorite, which one touched her heart the most. She had to think for a long time, and then she spoke about the fly agaric, that wonderful, dangerous, beautiful mushroom with its red cap and white flecks. It's like a fairy tale mushroom, she said, and as a child I always thought fairies and elves danced on it. Later I learned it was poisonous, but that didn't make it any less marvelous. Perhaps the danger makes it even more beautiful. She told me about the quiet mornings in the Odenwald, when dew still lies on the leaves and the low autumn sun shines between the trunks. Then she'd go out, just her and the forest, searching for mushrooms. It's a game, a hide-and-seek game with nature. The mushrooms hide, and you have to find them. But you mustn't be greedy. You can only take what you need. You must respect the soil, the mycelium, the underground network that brings forth mushrooms like a heart pumping blood. Gertrude spoke about the old techniques of gathering mushrooms without damaging them. You use a knife, not your hands, to cut the base of the mushroom so the roots stay intact. You take only the largest, only the most beautiful. You leave the smaller ones standing so they can still spread. It's craft, real craft, where you work with nature, not against it. She described the different mushroom species of the Odenwald, each with its own story. The pennybun, noble and expensive, the king of mushrooms. The chanterelle, modest but precious with its fine flavor. The bay bolete, dark and firm, like a little treasure. The flocco-stemmed witch's bolete, poisonous but wonderful to look at. The common fly agaric, the devil among mushrooms. She knew them all, knew their habits, their ways of life, where they liked to grow. I asked her whether it wasn't difficult doing this work alone, these mushroom walks, when modern people just go to the supermarket. She shook her head and smiled. No, she said, because there are still people who want to understand. There are still children who lift their eyes to the sky and ask what this marvelous thing is growing under the leaves. There are still older people who remember when it was normal to gather your own mushrooms. She told me about a walk she'd done the week before, a family with small children who'd never seen a real mushroom before. The mother was surprised mushrooms don't grow in the supermarket, but come from the earth under special conditions. The father laughed at the idea there were poisonous mushrooms you weren't allowed to eat. The children knelt down and examined the mushrooms with wondering eyes. That's my pay, Gertrude said. This wonder. She described the route of the mushroom walk she normally does. She starts in the south of the Odenwald, where the beech forests love mushrooms. She shows people the differences between edible mushrooms and poisonous ones. She teaches them how to recognize a mushroom not just by its cap, but by its stem, by the structure of its gills or tubes. She shows them that nature can only be learned by those ready to look closely, ready to be patient. She also told me about her passion for mushroom lore, how mushrooms are actually fruit trees, fruits of a vast underground network. The mycelium, she said, is the real wonder. It can work for years, even decades underground, until the mushroom suddenly breaks through the soil. And if you gather mushrooms properly, cutting rather than pulling, then the same mushroom comes again next year at exactly the same spot. She also described how she shows her mushroom books. She has old, handwritten notes from foresters from the 19th century who documented mushrooms. These books are like treasures to her, she said, because they show how the mushroom world has changed. Some mushrooms that were common then are rare today. That's a sign that something has changed in our forest. And when we arrived at Eberbach, Gertrude said goodbye to me. She gathered her mushroom bags and disappeared into the night. But not without giving me one last hint. Next autumn, she said, if you're in the Odenwald, look under the old beeches. There, where the leaf carpet is thick and the mushroom scent hangs in the damp air, there the best mushrooms grow. And you, dear listener, can now close your eyes and imagine walking through damp leaves, breathing in the mushroom scent, finding small wonders under your feet, and so, slowly, very gently, drifting into sleep. The train rolled on so gently, and outside, the world was all darkness now. Just a few lights in the distance, odd windows where other people too were settling down to rest. I thought about how many people in the world were falling asleep at that very moment, each in their bed, in their compartment, in their room, and how we were all part of one great, quiet movement, a movement into sleep. The rhythm of the wheels on the rails, ta-dum, 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 was like the breathing of some great, friendly creature carrying us all together through the darkness, through time. My eyes grew heavy, so heavy, as though someone had gently laid a warm hand on my eyelids and said, "Now it's all right. Now it's enough for today." And I heard the train, ta-dum, ta-dum, and I heard the quiet breathing of another traveler already asleep, and I heard the distant whisper of wind at the window panes, and all these sounds were like a soft blanket laid over me, layer by layer, warmth by warmth, until I felt nothing but the train's smooth gliding through the night.